First of all, some of you may say, look, I knew some of those things. I knew relationships were important. I knew it's important to know whether you're being true to yourself. I know givers are happier than takers. I know you got to be in the moment and live the moment. But as one of these people said to me, it's not enough to know when you know you got to go. And so don't ask yourself, do I know those secrets? Ask yourself, am I living them? Which one of them, if I could only choose one, do I most need to focus on? And one of the challenges of life is that so often we wait for a wake-up call before we really live our values. Think of my friend David Young, who was a senior editor at Inc. magazine, and he was only 35 years old, and one day he was there at the Inc. offices in Boston, and it was the end of the day, and he just felt kind of a pressure in his chest. He didn't think of it for a moment until a few moments later, it literally felt like Mount Everest was on my friend David's chest. The next thing he remembered was waking up on a gurney in the emergency room in Massachusetts General Hospital, listening to the faint but highly irregular beat of his heartbeat as he was about to go in for emergency cardiac surgery. And my friend David said in that moment, he said, I did what anyone would do in that moment besides pray, or whatever you did to try and buy more time. He said, I started thinking about my life. He said, and at 35 years old with Zen-like clarity, I knew if I lived through that surgery what I would do differently. He said, I asked a nurse in the emergency room for a piece of paper, and I wrote down 5 things on a piece of paper, and I put it in my pocket. Now, by the way, this is not one of those depressing stories. He didn't die and his wife found the note in his pocket. He lived, right? He called me up a few months later, said, John, he told me the story. He said, the good news is I'm alive. He said, the bad news is I've got the list. And you might wonder, what did my friend David write on that list? The first words he wrote was, play more. He said, I love my work, I love my job, but I don't play enough. He said, I need to play more. The second thing he wrote down was family. He said, my parents, my brothers and sisters, they're not getting any older, any younger. He said, I've got to make sure to make time to connect with them. He wrote down the words, give back. And didn't even know what that meant. He just knew he wanted to give back more in his life than he did before. And he wrote down the words, he didn't even where it came from, have a son. And you have to understand, David at the time was not married. He didn't have any immediate prospects, but he wanted to be a parent. And over the next 18 months, he carried that simple list around with him, and he would look at it every day. And it changed his life. He not only played more, but he started a foundation in his father's name. He wound up adopting an 11-year-old disabled child who no one would adopt. And David gave Dylan a home that no one else would give a home. But then I love what David said to me, a question I will ask you. He said, why would we wait for a wake-up call to make a list we could make any day of our life? And what I'd ask you today is, what would be on that simple list if you were on that gurney right now? And it might not be the things that David wrote down, but whatever they are, now's the time. Now, I had a very poignant reminder of that as I did these interviews. Those of you who read the book will discover this. But remember Don Klein, the psychologist? People often ask me, did you have favorite elders? And I guess, when you interview people like this, you're not supposed to have favorites, but I admit I had like 5 or 6 favorites, just people who, for whatever reason, touched my heart. And Don Klein was one of those people. And after I had interviewed Don, he lived in Baltimore, I live in the Pacific Northwest. I said to Don, I called him up, I said, Don, I want to be your friend. I said, I just loved interviewing you so much. I would like to be your friend. And Don said, I would love that, John. Next time you're in Baltimore, give me a call. And I gave Don a call. I was going to be in Baltimore from Northrop Grumman. He said, let's have dinner. I said, great. I arranged the dinner. As the time got closer a few days before, the client asked me, could you do this dinner the night before? I called Don and said, Don, I'm sorry. I got to reschedule, maybe next time. 3 months later, I was in Baltimore again. We arranged to have dinner. Again, something came up. I wasn't prepared. I wasn't quite ready for my talk. I said, Don, look, let's do it next time. Finally, we're a month away from having dinner again, and this time I'm saying I'm definitely not going to cancel on Don this time. I really want to be his friend. And one morning I come in, and in my email box is this email with this. You can appreciate this. This was the subject line, FW, the passing of Don Klein. For 5 days I won't open the email because I know what it is. In 5 days I finally get the courage to open it up. It's an email forwarded from the person who had recommended I interview Don, from his son, sent to all his friends. I'm not one of them, obviously. And the email says, dear friends, I wanted to let you know that my father, passed away last week in California. He said, I know he's touched many of your lives. He said, but, I hope you will celebrate his life because, right up until the end, at 88 years old, he was living the way he'd always lived. He had just come back from a transatlantic cruise with his brother, who's been after him for 20 years to do it. He said he had just spoken about love, his greatest passion, in California. And just after coming off the stage, he'd gone back to the table, sitting with his best friend, and his heart just gave out, and he died in the arms of his best friend. But it was no consolation for me because I'd missed it. All that advice that people had given me, don't wait, do it now. And I hadn't done it. And then I remembered in my sadness that we had taped all these interviews. And I actually had Don Klein's interview. So I went and I put on my headset and I listened to my interview of Don Klein. I listened to him talk about how he met his wife at a college dance when he was 20 years old, and how his friends had all told him, she's going to reject you, she's going to say no. And he said, even as a young man, I thought to myself, I do not want to be an old man wondering what would happen if I went out and asked that woman to dance. And 56 years later, she died in his arms when they were 80 years old. And then I remembered him talking about the psychologist and how you have to forgive yourself for the life that you've lived, even if you've made mistakes. And then I heard him tell a story I'd forgotten that he had told. Because, see, I asked each one of these people, now that you're older, how do you feel about dying? Because I wanted to know. And almost all of them said to me, you know what? If you live a good life, you won't be afraid to die. And I listened to Don Klein tell this story. I asked him, Don, are you afraid to die? And he said, well, let me tell you a story. He said, 4 years ago, he said, I have a heart condition. 4 years ago, my heart stopped. He said, and I was actually, technically dead for about, a little over 2 minutes. He said, I can tell you, he said, first of all, he said, I didn't see a bright light. He said, I didn't meet Jesus. He said, which is good because I'm Jewish. He said, but I can tell you that in that moment when I was dying, I thought about my life. I thought about the life that I had lived. And I knew I had done it right. He said, in that moment, I was not afraid. Whatever was going to come next, he said, I was not afraid because I knew I had lived the life I had come here to live. He said, and since that moment, he said, I have not had 1 ounce of fear of death. And sitting there at my desk, a smile came through the tears because I knew what Don Klein was thinking in that moment in California in the arms of his best friend. Happy people are not afraid to die. And I knew Don had forgiven me even if I hadn't forgiven myself.